This week on The Futurists, Peter Middlebrook.
The political dispensation in society isn't helping us. This competitive, rather than collaborative approach to figuring out how we get ahead is killing our country, amongst other things.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tercek, and this week I'm talking to someone who I met for the first time in Dubai at the Futurist Summit that we held in September in 2025. Peter Middlebrook is a global economist, and he's also the CEO of Geopolitics, which is an advisory firm, and we're going to learn more about his business and his activities in this show. Peter, welcome to The Futurist. It's great to see you here, and thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It was very fun to hear your comments in Dubai. I was very struck in particular by your commentary about the global refugee crisis. And I have to be candid with you. I think like many Americans, it's not a topic that I dwell on, and it's something that's far from my attention. And the sheer size and scope of the problem, but also the duration of the refugee crisis was really quite striking to me when you mentioned it.
It's a failure of global public goods. And there's many historical reasons for that. And that's really on the back of, the reforms in 1947 on the back of the Second World War, which led to the establishment of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods organizations as well, with a very clear mandate. But if you actually look who funds the UN system, it's predominantly still 80% Western. So it's been a Western agenda, and it's been based out of New York. And increasingly, for various different reasons, the international community is underfunded. ODA is in relative free fall, as you probably know. So free money in the system that is available for refugees is becoming incredibly hard. At the same time as capitalism is now working in extremes. I would say there's no such thing as capitalism. There's more just models and less just models. We're now moving towards a less just model of capital accumulation, which leads to trillionaire, billionaire oligarchs, the stripping out of the middle class, and then these kind of, peripheral issues, which are dominated by very large groups of people. Exactly.
And a growing percentage of people who are poor, right? So there's, even though on an overall basis, the abstract numbers seem to be improving, right? So global health is getting better, access to education, access to clean water, all those indicators are better, but there's a redistribution upwards of wealth. And the problem is that for those who are not getting those benefits, for the people who are refugees, people who are stateless, these people are left out of that equation. There's nothing left for them. How many people are refugees on the planet?
So it depends. I mean, the categorization has changed a lot over the years. So you've now got the wider classification would be forcibly displaced people. And that goes beyond refugees. Traditionally, in the 1970s, 1980s, prior to that, refugees were largely drought-based. So you had, Sahel drought cycles where people got displaced because of lack of rainfall. And this was seen as temporary cycle, but it was cyclical every 4 years, depending upon what happened with El Nino or global kind of climate changes. But the reality is conflict, climate, and other factors have now changed that. So you have about 111 million people who are forcibly displaced. And then there's the refugee category that UNHCR deals with in particular, which are probably 65 million. But there's lots of other categories of people. But you have pretty much 250 million people out of an 8+ billion population who are not formally co-opted into that system, that capitalist system, for various reasons. Some of this relates
to what I would refer to as refugees. So 250 million people who've been displaced, who are rootless, who are living in temporary shelters, typically some sort of camp. And also they have low mobility. They're not able to leave those shelters. Typically they're tolerated, but they're not welcomed. I was quite surprised when I visited Jordan a year ago. Mm-hmm. I was quite surprised to know that there are 6 million Palestinians in Jordan, and they've done a fairly good job in that country of integrating them. You can work, you can have a home, you're not stuck in a camp. There are still people in camps, though. And I guess this is the part of the conversation that struck me while we were in Dubai, is this problem seems to linger and fester. There's no solution. So it's possible today for some of those 250 million displaced people to be stuck in a refugee situation forever. There is no hope. There is no chance for them to integrate into a society. They won't go to college. They won't go to school. They won't have jobs. They won't be able to own a home.
They're deeply disenfranchised. I mean, I lived out in the Middle East for much of my life. I was a personal advisor to President Karzai for almost 10 years in Afghanistan. Until recently, I was appointed by the president of the World Bank and the World Bank Group as the co-lead on the conflict recovery framework for Gaza as well. I know Jordan particularly well, Transjordan as it was. So
Yes.
the reality is that my good friend Parag Khanna, who's a globalist like myself, has just written a book called Move. I'm not actually plugging his book, but it's a great book. Everyone moves
You are
all the
plugging in. It's okay.
Oh, it's good. Everyone moves all the time. We have this bizarre perception that the world as it's been the last 20, 30 years is the world of reference. It is not. You just go back thousands of years, so way beyond the original religious text. We might be a 1,000,000-year-old species, and our civilizations have waxed and waned. And what happens is you get these periods of great forgetfulness, where when an empire or an imperial power collapses, much of the knowledge that was known at that point just falls. And Egypt is a good example of this. But the Middle East is that the population is likely to double. Political stability is a precondition for providing support to individuals who might be disenfranchised and refugees. That requires we have the capital to solve that problem, which is not an easy one. But political stability is going to be a major player going forward, as you see kind of the levels of world conflict are likely to increase. Pax Americana, of course, as you know, is being contested. And so there's lots of, and the levels of public debt are also increasing. And there's many different reasons for that, but many governments are paying. Take the US, for example. I think your debt servicing costs every single year is almost $1 trillion. A trillion
Yes,
dollars.
it's going to become larger than our social services and our defense budget.
So it's like the UK. We have a capitalist society, but we have a socialist budget. And that is it. Well, this is just the nature of things. And most people have forgotten to read, some of the core texts, political economy texts of history to understand how this works out. And, I always say this. So if you're running a $2 trillion a year budget deficit, two things are happening here. Number one, you're borrowing from the future. And what does that mean? It means that the things which aren't working now, which is causing these problems, are not being addressed. You're just kicking the ball up the road, okay? So you're not reforming to address the fact that actually...
effectively, you're taxing future generations because they're going to be carrying that debt.
Right, but the assumption of the Fed is that they monetize debt or they inflate their way out of it. So 5%. So if you have, let's say, 30 plus trillion in debt, for example, but got 5% of inflation rate. The reality is, right, that about $1.5 billion of real value is being written off every single year. So this is the game. Now, this is leading to what? Asset price appreciation, but wages are running flat. So you've got this sort of situation. So life is becoming much more unaffordable for most people. And now, if the tax places the middle class, and you're going to the middle class to pay for this problem, you're draining the middle class at the same time as other things are happening as well. But in terms of wider stability, the reality is this is the human species. We've always had people who are disenfranchised, and there's always been large groups. In terms of the overall statistics, people are probably on the aggregate far better off than they've ever been in human history. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it is debt financed. It's borrowed from the future. So the classic case would be, if we didn't take debt, does this current ideology stand up? If we can't borrow from the future, because at some point we won't be able to do that. And let's take the example with the US, which is a very significant issue. You have 750 military bases around the world, substantially funded through debt. What would happen if you had a deep debt crisis? I don't think you will. I don't think you're going to, default necessarily.
It's certainly a possibility. It's a non-zero possibility.
Well, at some point it might, unless Pax Americana reconsolidates its strategic resource interests.
And we seem to be losing our appetite to be the world's policeman at this point, right? So maybe we're going to withdraw from that, which is a radical implication, right? We've discussed this previously on the show. What happens if the U.S. stops patrolling the sea lanes? If the U.S. Navy pulls back, if we retreat from some of those 800 bases around the world, it does seem like the United States is losing interest. So I think that's a real possibility. If that occurs, I don't think people have a very good historical understanding of what happened before the sea lanes were safe, which was the case for 5,000 years. And that's piracy and, you have disruptions and ships being taken and so forth. Strangely, the United States government is seizing ships right now in Venezuela, which I think... I don't think I would say that the people who are running the U.S. government have very little understanding of the long-term implications of what they're doing. They're setting a very poor example for the rest of the world.
So, I mean, it's a challenge to international law, but international law has been in free fall for decades, to be perfectly honest. past, right? We've had a litany of conflicts which were not mandated by the UN Security Council. I mean, forget the discussions on the membership of that structure. But the reality is that all empires, what happens? The United States was a free open market. Everybody went there, they started investing. And you've had a great 200-300 year run. But you've reached the zenith of rates of return to growth. There's only so much GDP growth you can squeeze out. You're not going to go back to the days of 7, 8, 9, 10%. Now, if the entire world is now capitalist, which in strategic terms it is, not a communist capitalist bifurcated system, right? But everyone's doing it. The reality is, and so if you outsource the industrial complex to India, to China, for example, what are you doing? A lot of these products are being reverse engineered and they're being sold on markets which are closer to China than they are. So the growth in the future is Asia. There's no doubt about that at all. Now, the question is, what happens in the United States in all of this? Well, this is why the IMF and World Bank, we talk about what we call this Twin Peaks scenario, where the North America will consolidate South America. Might be seeing that at the moment. Mm-hmm. And China and SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the southern and strategic corridors into the Middle East, where Israel is pivoting to Asia because of this demographic collapse in the West and the kind of growth potential here. And then the struggle is for Africa. So you've got these two major political structures. And in the US at the moment, the way to understand something like Venezuela would be all the BRICs are de-dollarizing. And you can also understand all the changes when Trump came in on official development assistance. Why are you providing money to a country that's actively trying to undermine you? It doesn't happen. So the problem with the collapse of ODA is a lot of it went into the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, into refugees and so forth. If Western powers are now facing conflict at home, debt servicing costs which are high, look at the war in Ukraine. How is it going to be financed? Well, either repurposing Russian assets which have been taken, sovereign wealth funds, which is not an easy thing to do, or ODA, or debt. Those are the options. Now, so what are you going to do? Just let Ukraine spin out, or actually start funding that and strip it out of these other areas? So there's huge risks in all of this. China, of course, is expanding its interest and its influence as well. I would say SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I lived in Afghanistan for 10 years. And I was the lead economist on the U.S. New Silk Road. And that was a forerunner to the Belt and Road Initiative. And we laid the foundation for much of that. And the U.S. didn't get its act together for various different reasons. But China has consolidated its interests for a long time. Venezuela is a major loss to China for various different reasons. But for countries that are actively de-dollarizing, I can understand why those who are running the U.S. dollar hegemony whilst they're looking to do this. Now, Venezuela has, of course, had stopped denominating oil exports in dollars too. So the reality, these kind of conflicts and turning over of governments, I think, are likely to be continue. Perhaps this may not be the first of many of these. What may happen to Taiwan and others on the other side, we don't know. Anyway, but this has been...
So let's pause for a second and recap, because you covered an awful lot there, and I want to try to unpack some of the key points that you made. Let's take it from the top. We have a debt-laden empire in the United States, and that empire seems to have passed its apogee in the sense that it can't continue to expand forever. Now, some people listening will object to that. They'll say the United States is not an empire. But to your point, there's a form of economic imperialism, and we might also add to that a kind of technological standards-based imperialism as well, whereby we extend the instruments of control around the world economy. Basically, if you're buying goods, particularly petrol, in dollars, and you're trading in dollars, and you're using the U.S. financial system to do that, then we have all the measures of control that we need without having to have boots on the ground and occupy countries the way old empires used to 100 years ago. So it's a modern empire. It's it's a streamlined empire. But nevertheless, it's a dollar-based global economy that's pegged to oil. And so what you just mentioned briefly, but I think we need to unpack that a bit, is the incidents that occurred in Venezuela when the United States has essentially kidnapped the president of the country, brought him back to the United States with allegations of drug trade or some sort of narco-terrorism, which hasn't been really substantiated. In effect, what the United States is seeking to do is exert its control over the oil supply in Venezuela and ensure that continues to be traded in dollars. And why that's important and urgent, and why the United States took action, you're saying that Venezuela was leaning towards de-dollarizing, working with the BRIC nations, and particularly China, to trade in some currencies that are not the U.S. dollar, and that would further destabilize the United States. And so, as a rearguard action to preserve the U.S. Empire, as I'm going to use that term because I can't think of a better one.
U.S.
But
strategic
as a
interest.
rearguard action to shore it up, we are seizing. We're actually taking over nations now and seizing, and we're going to force them to trade in dollars.
The reference point goes back to the point that if the reference point is anything post Second World War, and I would say this, for example, so one of the things I've been working on last year, I've just drafted the new international cooperation framework for Rwanda, for example, amongst many things. I travel normally 20, 25 countries a year, and we're doing a lot of this kind of stuff.
And you've done a considerable amount of work in Africa, right?
So, well, I spent 20 years World Bank, British government, European Union, and the United Nations, drafting mostly national investment strategy. I led the drafting of the 10-year sustainable financing strategy for Indonesia, for Malaysia, for Egypt, for Botswana, for Bosnia-Herzegovina. So I'm a hardcore investment economist working, but I work a lot on international cooperation. But on the back of the Second World War, we had peace after the death of 70 million people. After the genocide in Rwanda, we have peace after the genocide. This apparently is a cycle of human nature. For the US, BRICS are actively de-dollarizing as a formal policy. It's not some inference. It's real and it's happening. Saddam Hussein, have you read? He started denominating oils in euro, not dollars. I won't go into all the details of this. I was an advisor to the Prime Minister in Iraq for 3 years, by the way. It was a completely separate game. But from a strategic point of view, the US is going to have to consolidate its interests to ever get a handle on this debt, or go the way of the British Empire. The British Empire couldn't afford, it was broke after the Second World War, couldn't afford to maintain India. They needed to partition it out. So the reality is, if you go back and don't look at the last 40 years, but look at the back thousands of years, right? This is normal. This is how it is. We just think it isn't. Now, international law comes on the back of a period of historical peace that we've perhaps not seen ever. But if you stand right back and you see what's going on.
And what you're saying is that powers rise, they extend, they become empires, and then they extend too far, and then they have to, essentially drain their own economies in order to sustain it, and they're taking on debt to do that, or they're raising taxes, or some combination of those things. And eventually you reach a breaking point, and that's when empires collapse.
There's nothing new in this. And you end up with a new economy, which is underregulated. So there's a price comparative advantage for producers or exporters, right? Okay. But what happens, of course, living standards grow, regulations grow, and at some point you're not competitive. Well, that's the UK. There's no one who's flooding into the UK. We've got to get into UK to do business. It's not happening. And so the reality is these cycles are everywhere. The Ottoman Empire, you can go through all of it. So this is the way it is. By the way, you're not an empire in any classical sense. You are an imperial power. But if you get rid of your 750 military bases, which are maintaining stability in this axis, get rid of those and you end up with a global vacuum. Well, if you're looking from a geostrategic point of view, who would fill that vacuum? And what would the new international order look like? It might be multipolar. It might be that. But China clearly is going to have to play a significant role into all of this.
And at least in their neighborhood. I mean, they're making it quite clear that they intend to extend their reach.
Included, the billions and billions they were putting into Venezuela. Their neighborhood is a global neighborhood. Now, the petro yuan is a real thing. Right. Okay. And so is eventually the central bank digital currencies, the US dollar, which have been piloted out of New York. China's already there as well. So if you're making decisions, I spend my entire life drafting government policy. I was the lead expert, one of the lead experts on the future of globalization, a report we launched many years ago with my good friend Richard Ponzio, who was the director on that. And we realized that globalization, the model of globalization, is likely to look like what we call hyperglobal, hyperlocal. So this is interesting. So I would say this, your phone is your most powerful form of colonialism ever. It comes right down to the individuals. Every place you go, everything you look at, and soon everything you spend is available. That information may not be available to governments, but it's available to global corporations. Mm-hmm. And this is why I always refer to the teleology over time of having religious states, nation states, and now we're moving to transnational corporations. So we have a hybrid reality. The hybrid reality is these global corporations are providing solutions that nation states haven't. And there's a challenge to all this. Take AI. Any AI model is automatically global when it's launched because anyone can use it. Any cryptocurrency is automatically a global currency the moment it's launched. So we have these global new norms and new ways of working which are being established.
That no government can really manage, right? They're outside of the purview of a national government. They can try to restrict it or they can ban it, but they can't control it.
They can't control it, and maybe the future, maybe governments have done a good job to get us to here. So you have a lot of digital service delivery models. In the health sector, it doesn't have to be wait till someone. We can be much more preventive. Healthcare has traditionally been curative. That's where the money's been. Much more would need to be spent on preventive care to actually prevent. Now, if you're wearing a health bit, and it's providing all this data to your medical supplier, and certain things are triggered. Okay, these are major life changes. On the education side, I think it's Israel that started with its own agentic AI for each individual student. Why can't you have a direct ask to the best maths teacher in the world, or education provider, or historian? Well, you can. So that's going to disrupt the entire education system. So disruption is here. We're in the digital age, and this is what it looks like. And there's winners and there's losers. Those who are winning, the city-states, Singapore, Dubai in particular, those who are progressively leaning into these realities, cashing in on saying, this is the future and we're going to bring it home now, whilst the rest of the world is using these old legacy reference points of how it used to be. But it's not how it's going to be. I mean, if they take an education system, if you look at most kids, right, they don't learn that much at school. I've just written a book, by the way, called Rich Student, Poor Student. And it's an interesting one. It's predicated on the assumption that most children at school spend the first quarter of a century of their life not being economically active. And they're taught to be employees and consumers, not investors and producers. No one's learning day trading and investment banking and all that. So the first quarter of a century of your life, you've done nothing. You're probably coming out in debt. In the
You're
US,
being indoctrinated to take orders, right? That's what public education does very well.
To be part of that. But more than anything else, if you come out with debt, the first 30 years of your life, you may not save $1. And then you've got 30 productive years. And if you're healthy, another 30 years retired, a third of your life needs to pay for 2 other thirds of your life. And it can't. This is the truth of the system. And the other part of it is most teachers have never been in the private sector. They know nothing about private business. So people go out. I remember when I left the World Bank, when I started my first business, I went out. I didn't realize that second place was the first loser, and that the light at the end of the tunnel was just another train coming. This is real life, real business, right? Mm-hmm. But listen, countries are businesses too, not just sovereign. US interests are business interests. Now, what's going to happen now is as multilateral order becomes challenged by the transactional approach to politics, which is what the Gulf states and China and other non-Western powers are doing, all that happened in Venezuela is a transactional approach. You're in the way of our interests. There you go, out. It's a challenge to international law, but who's policing international law? Who can enforce this? We have a vacuum. So one of the things I mentioned this very briefly, I'd originally been one of the first advocates for establishing a global political party because there's no oversight of globalization. Right? There's no oversight mechanisms for this kind of situation. All the institutions are weak. So anyway, I will stop there. Fascinating.
Okay, well, on that note, we need to take a break. So we're going to pause for one moment. But folks, if you're listening right now, don't go far because we'll be back in just 1 minute with more of Peter Middlebrook on the Futurists.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tercek, and this week I'm talking to Peter Middlebrook, a global economist. And candidly, this has been a wild ride so far because Peter knows so much about so many things, and he's able to make connections so quickly. I don't know how it's going for you folks who are listening, but for me, I've been hanging on to Peter's coattails here, trying to follow him as he jumps from topic to topic. The main takeaway here is Peter spent so much time working in different parts of the world as a global economist that he sees all the connections, and he can see how an incident in one corner of the world is going to affect other parts of the world, relations around the world. So let's continue. But today, for this part of the show, what I thought we would do is focus on one country in particular, a country that you know very, very well. In fact, you've just written a book about it. You've written a book about the UK, right? Tell me a little bit about your book, and then I have a series of questions for you.
Sounds good. So, I mean, the book has a slightly provocative title. It's called How to Make Britain Great Again. And it's a kind of blueprint for better Britain by 2050. This is not a call to being a colonial power in any sense at all. It's about fixing the problems that we have at home, because we're no longer a great country. I mean, you can go back to London and there's amazing institutions and beautiful buildings, but these are all part of our part of the colonial heritage and the many trillions that was perhaps taken out during
That's
that
true.
period.
As an American visiting the UK, it often feels like I'm in a theme park called England Land.
Well, it is. You only have to go into, Terminal 3 in Dubai or the new airport in Abu Dhabi and then arrive back in Terminal 4, Terminal 5. And it's like going back to the 1970s. So listen, a footnote to this, by the way. When I was 16 years old, I decided to travel the world. And I hitchhiked from England over to India. It took 2.5 months. I then spent a year in India, went up to China, did the Trans-Siberian all the way back, went right the way through, hitchhiked through the Sahara Desert, and then came back up through South America. So that was my education. My education as a globalist was not in universities. I went back and did my PhD part-time when I was working with the EU at a separate time of my life. But I've seen Britain from the inside and from the outside looking in. Now, I spend most of my life advising governments on modernization, and the UK goes into what I call managed decline. And there's many different reasons for this. So what my book does, it asks the question, what's wrong? And by the way, it's not unique to Britain. This is now a Western problem. Most countries, they don't have a long-term vision. Why is that? Well, it's just neoliberalism. The market will determine the outcome of this. We invest in the market.
Yeah.
Now, what happens if some of the players in the market are not playing the free market game that you are, but actually what they're doing is they're priming state-owned enterprise to subsidize entry into markets? They're going to win. So if you don't change the rules, what happens? I mean, this is the Chinese model in particular, which is a particular model of capitalism.
Right.
So what the book does...
The Chinese government is pumping money into specific industries. They have an industrial policy, and the industrial policy is to dominate manufacturing by flooding the market, right? So making it impossible, for instance, for German companies to export. And Germany depends so much on exports that it's eroding that country's economy. But let's go back to the UK. So right now, the UK is, I think you could say, stagnant. The UK economy is stagnant. The anemic growth, soft labor market. There have been some modest increases in wages, but they've been eroded away by inflation. So effectively, really no wage growth either. Deepening inequality, though not as severe as the United States. I would say, on the whole, it seems like the post-Brexit picture of the UK is very disappointing. Some economists say that the UK's economy is 6 to 8% smaller than it would have been if Brexit had not occurred. So let's wind back a little bit to Brexit, because I think that's a pretty important inflection point. What went wrong?
I say my personal view is that Brexit was not actually about economics. It was about other factors, which I don't think we're necessarily going to discuss here. But just park that to one side for a particular reason. The question is the long term, in my personal view. If you predict out in the next 20, 30, 40 years, if Britain doesn't respond to the opportunities which were created by Brexit, that's, of course, you'll get what you've got, which is an economy which is trading sideways, GDP kind of debt which is increasing, social spending which can't be brought under control. Nobody can restructure and reform the National Health Service and pension funds.
Right, and taxes were recently raised to pay for that, right? So you get increasing tax burden.
Almost 20,000 multimillionaires have left the UK as a result of this, and now they're discussing whether there's going to be an exit tax, to stop people from leaving of 20%. But the reality is it's mismanaged because governments need to be efficient. So one of the many things in my book, and I I spoke to a couple of people, those who were leading the reform of the public sector in New Zealand. It was an interesting one. So the analysis would be is, from the 1970s, 1960s, we were a largely nationalized economy. So when Thatcher came in, we liberalized markets. So shipbuilding went out to China and so forth as well. But that's what happens. Chinese wages were very cheap. And so if you put industrial production there, those, the benefits for those who own the means of production are huge. Now, we've been going into debt ever since then. We can't repatriate the industrial complex. We can't produce the goods which are being produced out of China. Now, Chinese wages, of course, are increasing, which is why there's a push to relocate industrial production into India. But it's not coming back to Europe per se. What happens if you look at the UK at the moment? If you can't grow anymore, the new growth has to be greater efficiency. Can you deliver more for less? If you can do that, that's a huge benefit. But that requires public sector reform. We have to reform the way the government does business because it outregulates. There's a lot of the regulations. They impede growth. They impede innovation. I'll give you a really good example. So I live in Dubai, although I don't spend that much time there because I travel too much. One of the largest free zones in the world is the Dubai Multi-Commodity Center. Mm-hmm. There's 30,000 companies there. Now, gold has shifted there. Diamonds, tea, all major commodities are being shifted there. Now, why did these commodities leave the West? It's because of the cost of doing business and taxation. So I asked myself in the book, why can't we have the largest free zone in the world outside of Thames Valley, London? Well, regulations won't allow it. But what's stopping us doing it? It's the belief that we can't. But if other countries are doing it to get ahead, we're going to have to do it. We're going to have to change the rules to stay in the game. If other countries are using transactional approaches to gaining access to critical raw material concessions, they're not just bidding through the market, they're giving sweetheart deals. If that's what's going on, we're going to lose every time. Right. If you go back to the period of Western wealth, it came through transactional approaches. The British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, these were the first corporates of the world, and they dealt with their armies in this way. So
it was trade backed up by gunboat diplomacy, right? So there was a muscle behind it. So what you're saying is that I guess one of the takeaways here, it's not just the UK, but most of the West has been under this illusion, I think, under a spell, which is neoliberalism and this idea, this sort of Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek notion that governments can't plan, there can be no central control, and therefore the free market is the best determinant of how to allocate resources. And we've been operating in that vein in the United States, more or less, for the last 50 or 70 years. It seems to me that other countries are no longer playing by that rule. Certainly China has a very directed industrial policy where they coordinate the economy, and it seems to be working. So is that what you're saying, that UK has one hand tied behind its back? And post-Brexit UK, it's a relatively small nation. It's no longer part of that big trade bloc. It's outside of that trade bloc. It still trades, half the trade in the UK is coming from Europe. It's just now it's more expensive. There's more process around it. They have struck trade deals with China and the United States and some other nations. So, they're succeeding in that respect, I suppose. But overall, the cost of doing trade with the UK has gone down. So the UK is losing on this global playing field. Other countries are doing a better job of marshaling resources, and then they direct regulation to support that industrial policy. Whereas in some respects, regulation in the West, certainly in the UK and the US, is fighting against the market forces that we profess to support. Is that a fair analysis? I mean, that seems like what you're...
I think that's a pretty good analysis.
What's the solution then? Is the solution for the UK government to become more like China's government? Is autocracy the plan?
Two things. I mean, you should ask yourself as a government, are we depending on debt to maintain a system that doesn't work? And if we are, how do we change that system to make sure...
Well, the answer to that is yes.
The answer. What is the business proposition and value proposition for UK as a pub, as a limited company, as a business? How does it operate, right? Okay, and how does it gain access to markets where it doesn't have access through the normal marketplace? That's a good question. It's one of the reasons Boris Johnson put the Department of International Development back into the Foreign Office, because these have been delinked. Foreign affairs and then aid were delinked. completely. But we are moving back towards transactionalism. The problem is, and the challenge, I was until last year, I was the team leader on this support for European development policy out of Brussels with the EU. So we were trying to do many things. We had a very large facility trying to support the EU interests in strategic markets abroad. The reality is the EU and the West is clinging to a multilateral order, which it created in its own image, but which is collapsing. So it's reluctant to move away from the thing that gave it a strategic advantage. It's not an easy thing to do. If you go into transactional approaches, you ask yourself, okay, we're not going to give money to countries all over the world for healthcare and education and things like that. We're going to focus on our strategic trading corridors, our strategic trading partners. We're going back to the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Well, some of this is beginning to happen. You probably know about IMEC, which is the India, Middle East and European corridor. I was working from the EU from the Greek side because, the corridor enters through Piraeus port in Greece, which ironically is a Chinese concession. But IMEC is designed to allow the next phase of industrialization from India to come from Mumbai, through Jebel Ali, the UAE, through the southern industrial corridors of Saudi, out through Haifa port in Israel, into Greece, serving Central and Eastern Europe and others as well. This is the next new play that's going on. But for Britain, we were a financial power. That's what it was. It was a financial service. It still are to a substantial degree.
That's right.
But, the reality
about 10% of the UK economy is financial services.
So there is that. But, but then you get to some very deep questions. So, for example, there are no problems with immigration. It's inevitable, it happens. There are no problem with immigrants unless you're taking immigrants who are not productive, don't obey the law, and if there's capital flight. And this is a deep problem. So the reality is, Britain has, like Europe and like the United States, the ability to attract the best of the best talent in the world, make the conditions to allow that to happen. So let's take an idea of this free zone outside of Thames Valley, which everyone's going to say it can't happen. And if it can't happen, it's because people don't want it to happen. They can't see the implications of it. Just imagine the talent that can flow into such a space using the potential of ours. Brilliant minds around the world, people who want to come and invest in Britain, but everyone's leaving. Well, it's a very old model, okay? We've got a debt problem. We need to fund X, Y, and Z. And the only thing we can do, therefore, is to tax people more and more and more. And it's not just the direct tax, it's the VAT and all the other costs in it. It's probably more than 60% of earnings go back into this public-private model that we have. It's breaking.
Okay, so that scenario is a downward spiral. Tell me, what's the positive scenario that you look forward to? Like, what would you like to see happen in the future in the UK?
So there's an interest. I mean, I think a more bipartisan approach across political parties to setting public policy. My book calls for a number of different things. It says that we should have a strategy 2050. We don't have a national strategy.
Yeah.
There's no document. We just got political party manifestos in the marketplace.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say it, that doesn't buy you history. History is when you sit down and say, these are our strategic trading partners, our strategic interests that maintain our relative economic stability, the ability to give out, but also to extract, to maintain the core, and to have a sustainable society that's growing.
And that has to be bipartisan, because otherwise it'll get whipsawed every time there's an election where the House changes hands.
Which is why I've called for the establishment of a royal commission. This is quite a complicated one. It doesn't really matter for me whether you're a royalist or whether you're not. If we want our country, politicians, okay, I have an old saying. I used to say this, that there's no point in politics unless it leads to progress. It's true. I live in the UAE. No one's deeply involved in politics, but in terms of those who live there. But guess what? The people who are empowered, they see the world as it is, and they're investing into it. That's what you want. So politics can be fine, but when it's this ping pong backwards and forwards over minutiae, shuffling deck chairs on a Titanic, and arguing over who's playing the violin is not the direction we need to go. So the reason for a call for a royal commission would be to say, the royal family, particularly under William, who's talked about one of his legacy pieces will be to modernize the UK. So modernizing means what? It means many things.
What is it to set forth a vision of what that would look like then, right? So that's missing. I agree. There's no national vision.
And let's have, and I've called for it in my book, when people go to school, they're not being taught about values in society. They're not being taught about financing or entrepreneurialism. They're being taught the old subjects for a legacy system which doesn't work anymore. But just imagine that what comes out with every child grows up thinking this is their role in society, right? This is how they play out, not this situation where people look down on teachers or health workers can get paid very, very little, but we look up to footballers, right? A very small minority of people, right? Why doesn't everyone feel valued in society? All of them. So the other thing that I've mentioned, and I realize this is, everyone kind of rolls their eyes at this, but we have up to 22% of our population, which is economically inactive, unemployed, or underemployed. How do we expect to grow if we're subsidizing that? And what we're not doing. So one of the there's two forwards on the book. One is by former Greek Prime Minister George Papandreou, who oversaw the debt crisis in Greece. And the other forward is by Lord David Richards, who was the former head of the British Army. So I've talked to him about what it would need to bring back not national conscription writ large for conflict, but voluntary conscription of those who are economically siloed. Give them some status in society, rebuild the social contract, and rebuild public goods infrastructure that we can't afford to finance.
Would they be participating in the military, or would there be some sort of social service that they would participate in?
Anything. It could be social servicing, rebuilding roads and bridges and public good infrastructure.
So it could be a skills building program that way as well. Then they would learn a trade.
The reality is, we assume at the moment the market will deal with it. So I'll give you an example of housing. We have a housing crisis, and we're trying to deal with it through the marketplace. And I'm not suggesting that we should have a state-owned enterprise that builds out housing for people. But by the way, there's so many changes that need to take place in the regulations around housing and urbanization. The regulations mean that we trade sideways. I was going to mention before this chart, which I saw yesterday, not a new chart for anybody, but look at the top 20 economies in the world since the 1980s, right? China like this, India like this. US has done pretty well, but a lot of the countries, France and Germany's done better than others for various different reasons. It's the European Union, but many countries are trading sideways and they're borrowing from the future. So it's going to lead to conflict. The social contract will start to break down social cohesion. I put a bunch of statistics in the back of my book. And one of them, which is staggering, is, when I grew up, you didn't lock the door in your house because no one was going to come and steal anything. Shoplifting incidents last year, 530,000. 500,000 people are stealing. Why? Because they can't buy it.
Yeah, it's true. It's a striking statistic. About half of UK citizens experience some kind of economic jeopardy. Right, they're in some sort of economic jeopardy. 1 out of 6 people in the UK cannot save any money, so they're basically spending everything that they make or everything they earn. So, and we have similar statistics here in the United States. In fact, I think it's closer to half the U.S. population has no savings. So these are the long-term impacts of this widening gap in income inequality as fewer and fewer people are able to extract more and more of the world's wealth. Then there's a growing percentage, and it's a very large percentage of the population that's in economic jeopardy. And they're going to start to do desperate things. I think that's inevitable, right? 'Cause that's the next thing they'll have. People are going to feed their families. They're going to do what they have to do that. Okay, so in this respect, what you're describing of the UK, I think pertains to many other countries. Certainly, France and Germany are experiencing their own economic troubles right now. In some respects, I think the UK is in much better shape than those two countries, candidly. And those are the two economic engines of the EU. So that raises questions for all of the EU. I think that's a real serious challenge. But tell me more about your prescription, because you talked about a royal commission. You talked about setting forth a bipartisan set of goals that could be sustained and maybe wouldn't vary too much even when the government changes hands from one party to another, so that there's some stability to it, because otherwise you'd be whipsawed. So what else is the solution for the UK? Tell me more.
Well, what I've done is I've laid out for every major sector in industry the current status, from industry to manufacturing to agriculture, healthcare, all of it. Looked at the current status and asked and then there's some cross-cutting chapters. They include things like foreign policy, what to do within NATO, for example. But it also looks at government efficiency, because it's a largely public sector reform piece, much of this. What's the role of the public sector? And it's been, we had through the 1970s, we had this new public sector management approach, and that was to spin out the private sector. Services could be delivered by the private sector at a cheaper cost, perhaps even better. But a lot of the concessions that we had in this case is they ended up, take railways, for example. You end up with Well, if you end up with a 20-year concession on a railway line and there's only one operator, you know exactly what's going to happen to the cost of transport. On the energy
More
side,
expensive to take a train in the UK than it is to fly to
no,
Europe.
it's correct. I mean, France and Germany have different models for energy extraction. They still subsidize. UK has the highest cost of energy. So, you're from an industrial provider point of view, forget it. There's nothing to do here. What the book lays out is the current status of play. It looks at cross-national comparators. Which countries in the world of similar comparators? What have they done that's been successful? Could it be applied here? What might be the impact of such an approach? And I've done it pretty much everywhere. And I can take into foreign affairs, foreign relations. We're not a superpower, we're a middle power. That's the truth directly. And that means we have to work in a different way. In India, for example, I lived in India for many years. India is not going to kowtow to British interests in the same way.
They no longer need to do so. That's right.
And why should it? But what would be a new foreign policy? And I give you a good example. So most people in the world could buy, it's true in the United States, could buy property in the United States if you could afford it. British citizens cannot buy property in India or China. It's not a reciprocal level playing field at all. Lots of changes need to take place in all of this. On the other side of it, which countries are of particular importance to us in the new model of growth that we may have, and how would we invest in those? Is there another way of investing, putting money on the table? This goes
and in your book, you actually you answer these questions. You address the questions that you raised.
The book answers all of the questions, so do go and buy it, obviously, okay. Right? But by the way, it's not unique to here. While we're on the call, George Papandreou, the former Prime Minister, just called me, because we're actually putting a book together on how to fix Europe. Europe faces the same sort of problems.
Yeah.
My take on Europe, I spent 10 years with the European Union. So my take on Europe is very, very simple. You have the central powers of Europe and a smaller Europe. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, what happened? Well, NATO expanded into that footprint. So you have this Franco-German Europe at the core, then this Anglo-American NATO, and the European project was expected to backfill the security structure. So that led to many things. One of the things it led to is a collapse in the common agricultural policy. The common agricultural policy used to subsidize rural areas, rural farmers, to allow us to be competitive against international imports and so forth. But if you join the European Union and everyone gets access to common agriculture, well, we can't finance it, so it's gone. Thus the collapse of rural economy. So Europe became too big. I'm working on the Western Balkans. I'm putting a new financing structure together for North Macedonia, for Kosovo, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Albania, for example.
Oh.
These Western Balkans, for example, they are surrounded by Western Europe. They're not swing states to the former Soviet Union, to Russia. They're surrounded by Western Europe. After 25 years, there's still no accession into Europe because of regulatory income. So after a quarter of a century, we still can't integrate these economies into Europe. So again, you ask yourself, it's not possible, or the rules and the bars that we're trying to jump over are too high. My personal belief is this: if we don't finance debt, let's ask you a question. If you don't take $2 trillion of debt next year to finance US government operations, you saw what Doge tried to do. They came in, Elon Musk saying, we'll cut $1 trillion. They
fell miserably short of their goal, right? They were trying to cut $1 trillion. They barely made it to 100 billion in cuts, and they had an insurrection on there.
Try cutting out $2 trillion.
Yeah.
See what falls, because that is the truth. That is the reality.
I mean, the United States is an insurance company with an army, right? That's essentially what we pay for with our taxes. Our $7 trillion buys us the Pentagon, social services, the healthcare and retirement, and very little else. The rest of it is a rounding error. The operating budget, the discretionary spending is very, very small. Most Americans don't realize that, and you cannot cut Social Security here. You cannot cut the retirement benefits. People will, again, you'll have an insurrection on your hands. So these seem to be intractable problems. Peter, give me some scenarios for the UK in our remaining time. Tell me about possible outcomes in the future. So positive scenario for, say, 10 years in the future.
So I would say, my book's it'd probably be criticized for being too technical, but the political dispensation in society isn't helping us. This competitive rather than the collaborative approach to figuring out how we get ahead is killing our country, amongst other things. Everyone's business is no business. There's a whole bunch of issues. Many years ago, I went back to Port Cooley's house, which is where the members of Parliament work from, just for 3 or 4 months. And I had privy access to writing some of the Prime Minister's questions, for example, on which we have a Prime Minister's questions time. But most of the big issues you and I have talked about, there's no discussion taking place here. The corporate world does this discussion. So
Yeah, it's
we
true.
have to change the nature of the debate. We have to have a national strategy. You have to say, where are we by 2050, 2070? How does it look? Where's our competitive advantage? Where's our comparative advantage? And where's our collaborative advantage? And let's be clear on those. And then let's build our society around that. It doesn't happen at the moment.
Do you have a picture of what that looks like? Like, tell me what you think that advantage would look like for the UK in 10 years.
So UK still has the ability, still brilliant people in Britain, absolutely. A brilliant history, brilliant understanding. We still have great people. A lot of deregulation needs to take place, of that I'm sure. A lot of new regulations fit for the future need to be established. The public sector needs to be fundamentally overhauled. Now, no Prime Minister wants to touch this because it's a bit like Brexit. You can't judge Brexit after 2 or 3 years. And I'm maybe agnostic on it. You can't just say, it's the same with Trump coming in. Lots of issues around this. We'll see in the next decade the implications of these changes. Now, I don't know what happens. At the moment, UK is not doing very well, but it's also not reforming. There's the new party reform.
Right, it's just going sideways. It's like a caretaker. Honestly, the last 3 prime ministers struck me as caretakers. They were kind of shuffling paper and following through, but they weren't setting any bold policy. Keir Starmer, he's not terrible, but he also isn't igniting any kind of fervor, right? He's bland by design, I think.
So there's this, without any kind of personal attacks on individuals, if you want everything to change, so if everything stay the same, then everything must change. I think that's inevitably true. And there is very little change. It's like, this is where we are, and let's just hope that the next 1,000 years things will be good to us. But people are leaving, capital is leaving, brilliant people. We can have
is accumulating. And wealth is being distributed unequally. So no, those problems are going to fester.
This leads to the crisis you have.
So the default path is a very negative scenario for 10 years from now for the UK, because all these problems will worsen unless something changes.
I think that's inevitable.
Okay, and what you're proposing is a positive outcome. So certain changes need to occur. What does that look like in 10 years? What does the UK look like?
First of all, it's having a true national debate on the status of where we are and where we want to see ourselves in the world which is emerging. That does not exist. Does not exist. The levels of investment in AI or crypto or digital is a fraction of what France is doing. It's a fraction of what France is doing.
Yeah.
So we're not.
UAE is more aggressive, astonishingly, right?
The UAE is in space. This is the reality.
That's right. And they're building a giant data center. They've got their own AI models and so forth. Like, that is a country that has a very clear vision of the future.
In an ideal world, and this may never happen. Although my book is being sent to all the people, including at the top. I think that to have a look at it. Let's imagine you could establish a royal commission. Let's imagine you could put a strategy that says, listen, we all agree that this is how we'd like to see our country by 2050. And that will take care of a large percentage of day-to-day political rubbish. Let's focus on collectively working together on these common issues that we have. Not saying we have a problem with the National Health Service, but we won't address it. When the next party gets in, they're not going to address it either. It's just going to go back. Let's just sit down and say National Health Service is broken. It's half as good as the French system. It costs much more. The waiting period for most people is crazy. It's 1/4 of a year plus. There's 7 million people on the waiting list. It's not a functional system for a modern state. Let's deal with it. Let's not deal with it by saying this party will have to pick it up, but then they won't be re-elected. Let's deal with it by taking these things off the political mainframe and say, these are structural issues, and let's deal with them, all of us, at this level. So, one of the things I did in the book, I took the 4 major manifestos for the 4 major political parties, including Reform UK, which has a very different approach. Keir Starmer, if you look at the Labour Party, 35 photographs of Keir Starmer. It's a highly personalised sort of agenda. It's not about the nation per se. Now, it's not about us. It's about our children and, what happens in 2, 3, 4 generations, because that's how long this will take to happen. So we need that clear vision. The marketplace isn't working necessarily to our advantage anymore. So that discussion needs to take place. And what the book has laid out is what are the options in every single one of these areas for such a team to come together and say, well, how would it work? Now, some of these reforms are not easy. And perhaps I would argue this: democracies are not very good at certain things. You take a genius and an idiot and they cancel each other out. Okay? This is the problem with all of it. If you have to appeal to the aggregate common view on things that might be myopic, you have a problem. So we are going to have to change the way ideas navigate through the system. And if they're valuable and can work, that they can be transacted. And how can that happen? The book lays that out a little bit. So the challenges are there. The US faces the same issue, I believe.
Yeah, it's true.
Other European
It's all too easy for a populist to come make very powerful claims and promises that are and tell lies. If that person has tremendous amounts of charisma, they can outclass any mediocre politician, right? And that's the problem that we have. Actually, you've got the same problem with, because Nigel Farage is a fellow who is very charismatic.
It's an Anglo problem. We say talk is cheap, money buys whiskey. The reality is it's very easy to come up and talk a big deal. But, the reality is, reform is going to happen probably as a result of necessity. There will be a coming collapse of some sort. It doesn't work anymore, right? The best people are leaving. And not enough capital is coming. So that will force a change. I was looking at the history of Dubai, and I'm running out of time. Dubai has reinvented this very, very well, very interesting. They went into pearls, and then the Japanese put artificial pearls, so they got frozen out. So then they went into ports, right? Okay, they couldn't get into oil, couldn't discover it, so they went into large industrial, shipping stuff, and then they did find oil. Now oil's going, so they've now got free. They have reinvented themselves, but they don't have to appeal to the average person to say, "What do you think?"
Right. If you've got an emir who can make a decision, it helps. It's a little faster. The process is a little faster. That is a country that is not afraid to make a 50-year bet, right? A massive infrastructure bet on the future.
We didn't used to be afraid of that. My book makes it very, very clear. Why are we afraid of not being shaped by the future, but shaping the future? Why are we not doing it? There's so many examples given of countries. I was doing the 10-year financing strategy for the government of Indonesia, which we launched at G7 and G20. And the reality is a lot of young people in that administration. You bring a forward idea, they pick up on it, they run with it. 2 years later, there you go. Mm-hmm. You bring that idea back to some other place in Europe, and you have an elderly population. If you have an average demographic age of 39, we may have an average age of 49. Think about it. And I was looking, it's very interesting. If we didn't have abortions, about 250,000 new Brits will be born every year. That's 2.5 million people every 10 years. That's the replacement of the economy. So there's lots of decisions, complicated decisions out there. But we are in relative decline demographically, in terms of age. We have a fiscal problem. We have a reform problem. We have a problem of a political structure which is not investing progressively in the future. We're not leading much, despite having brilliant people. And the US is in a slightly different case. You have grown a lot, but you have more to maintain than we do. But take the view of this: at the end of the Second World War, we could not afford empire. It collapsed under us, and the baton was passed to the United States. One thing I will say as well is I would say this: capitalists are not globalists. So not nationalists. Sorry, they don't care too much about your national economy. If you can invest and be more productive by leaving, people will leave.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, money is not a patriot. Peter, in our closing minutes here, we're going to need to wrap up.
We are wrapping up. You mentioned about the allocation of resources. Globally, a global view is you would allocate resources and there'll be countries which are winners and losers in that. And that's what you see.
Wow. This has been a stimulating conversation. I've enjoyed every minute of it. Peter, tell me where people can learn more about you. You've written a number of publications on the web and so forth. What's the best place for people to find out more about Peter Middlebrook?
Oh, petermiddlebrook.com. There's probably some good stuff under there, I would imagine. My details are there. Happy to speak to anybody.
And tell me again the name of the book and where we can find your new book.
So it's called How to Make Britain Great Again, a blueprint for a better Britain by 2050. It's available on Amazon. Great. And it's available for anybody who wants to find it. These issues are everywhere. They're not unique to UK, but I'm British. I'm interested in see what consensus we can form around them.
And next book will be about how to fix Europe. So you'll extend that blueprint to Europe.
We're working on that. I've just arrived in Athens, and I have discussions the next couple of days with some former heads of state here, and we're going through since we had a failure of the European Constitution. That's had ramifications all the way through. And now Europe, which didn't start the war in Ukraine, obviously is now funding it. So we have deep issues to solve. Don't have an immigration policy, don't have a foreign policy. I can go through all of them. If we can't fix those, we're a trading bloc with 27 different sets of interests, and that's a challenge. So we see.
Well, Peter, it's been a great pleasure talking to you today on The Futurists. Thank you for joining us. Folks, I hope you will check out petermiddlebrook.com and learn more about this brilliant thinker and his global prescription for the economy.
You are so very kind.
We'll have another future thinker for you next week on The Futurist. Every week, we'll bring someone who is thinking about shaping and actively working to build the future that they envision. Until then, we'll see you in the future. Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.